last recording, we introduced the Arab-Israeli conflict by looking at the history of how Israel came to be with the status of the Jews and also the Arabs who lived in what's known as Palestine. We looked at the history of both and how different religious texts promise different things to different people, which kind of sets the stage for a big conflict in a very small area of the world. We looked at what Zionism is, which was something that happened in the modern era, and it was the idea of the Jews pressing for a homeland in their original land of Palestine. We looked at the effect of World War I on the region by seeing how the British made three contradictory statements to different groups throughout World War I in order to try to get what was best for them, and that further made the tensions between the Jews and the Arabs in Palestine escalate. Today we're going to pick up with what happened after World War I in discussing the mandated territories that were prescribed by the League of Nations, which was, as we know, created after the First World War. So if you look at page 95, this is where this begins. And we know that the League of Nations had a covenant, and we discussed before how the covenant of the League was very vague in a lot of areas and didn't really provide clear directions on how steps were going to be enforced and resolutions were going to be enforced. But one thing that was made clear in the League of Nations covenant was that the territories of the Central Powers were going to be adjusted. And in some cases, places would be given full independence, but in other cases, these territories that had belonged to the Central Powers, and I'm referring to territories in continents like Africa and Asia and also in areas of the Middle East, these were going to be divided up and administered under the victors of World War I. So, one of these particular places was Palestine, like we had said previous to this, that the Ottoman Empire had controlled what included Palestine in the Middle East before World War I. And obviously, since they were part of the Central Powers, they were now the ones who were going to have to give up these territories. So, these mandated territories that the League of Nations set up were divided into three different levels, A, B, and C. A-level territories, or mandated territories as we can call them, were seen as those that were most ready to become independent soon. But they would need to be administered for some time to make sure that they had the conditions right for statehood. Levels B and C were seen as those territories, mostly in Africa, that were going to take quite some time and maybe never be ready for independence. So for those people, they were going to be administered by another country for quite some time into their future. Palestine, along with some other areas in the Middle East, if you look at page 96 in your book, you can see a map. These were considered A-level mandates, and they were given to the two main European victors of World War I, Britain and France. So you can see how it was divided up with this map. Syria and Lebanon were given to the French, whereas Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine were given to the British to administer. And basically the administering, or what we call the mandatory powers, which are, in this case, Britain and France, had two main responsibilities when it came to these territories that were being given to them. Number one, they had to administer them, which means they had to make sure certain rules and procedures were put in place and that there was a government set up that was being held responsible, that they were meeting the needs of the people, that they were being civil and not erupting into chaos. But at the same time, and the other responsibility was to make sure that all nations had equal access to these territories. So in other words, immigration from different countries was to be allowed into these territories. So obviously this would be a problem when it came to Palestine because of the fact, like we said from the very beginning of the first recording, there are two main groups that live in Palestine and have lived there throughout history, the Jews and the Arabs. And we saw that during World War I, the British made different statements to these different groups that contradicted each other. So obviously the British were going to have a difficult time in carrying out these two responsibilities in Palestine. So they were responsible for making sure that the Jews that were living there at that time, but also that would be coming in, would have freedom and security, but they also wanted to make sure that the Arabs weren't freaking out that there was going to be a huge wave of Jewish immigrants into Palestine simply because the British were the ones who were administering it. We saw from the Balfour Declaration, which was given in 1917, that the British government definitely gave the impression that they were supportive of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So that's why a lot of Arabs were concerned, now that the British were governing them, that they would just allow huge amounts of Jewish immigrants into Palestine. And the Arabs regarded Palestine as their land, as did the Jews. So this was going to be a very problematic issue for the British for quite some time after World War I. The goal of these A-level mandates was that eventually, in the near future, they would be ready for independence, or what we call autonomy. It means the same thing as independence. But here was the situation with giving Palestine autonomy. There were more Arabs living there directly after World War I than Jews. So if you gave that territory independence immediately, or without too much time, the Arabs, being the ones that were in greater numbers, would obviously have control over the area, and the Jews there would be in the minority. They probably would be discriminated against or treated worse, and if they were an independent country, there wouldn't be an outside country that could step in and stop that. So that was an issue with giving Palestine its independence in the near future. Some of these issues with who was going to be living there, what the borders were going to be, was going to be something that had to be decided first. If you look again at page 96, you can see the population statistics in 1918, which was the conclusion of World War I, and the fact that there were over 500,000 Muslims, and then only 61,000 Christians and 66,000 Jews. So they were clearly outnumbered by Muslims in the region. Because of this, there was concern among the Jewish people that they would be sacrificed by the British government, and the British would give Palestine its independence before the Jews were guaranteed certain freedoms and protections from the Arabs. Meanwhile, there were those in the British government that didn't necessarily agree with giving the Jews their home in Palestine, despite what was said in the Balfour Declaration. If you look at the top of page 97, in 1922 there was a paper issued by the British government. It was called the White Paper of 1922, and you'll see another one on the next page from 1939. These are two different documents. They're both from the British government, and if you look at the White Paper of 1922, it basically gives the impression that, yeah, the British are still in favor of giving the Jews a homeland in Palestine, but they definitely made a distinction here that they didn't want all of Palestine to be a Jewish homeland. It's simply, they're trying to say that in the Balfour Declaration that they supported an idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but not necessarily all of Palestine. So that was definitely something that was a concern for the Jews. You can see underneath the excerpt of the document that the Jews were definitely disappointed by this. And remember, Zionists are Jews who were trying to get themselves a homeland in Palestine. They kind of thought that they were left holding the bag. They had been given the impression back during World War I that the British government supported them having a homeland, and now it seems like the British are kind of going back on that. Also, it was flat out rejected by the Arabs, who you would think would have liked this white paper because it kind of showed that the British were willing to give the Arabs some consideration. But the Arab nationalists, they did not want a Jewish homeland at all to be created in Palestine. So even though this white paper seemed to be more pro-Arab, it was flat out rejected by Arab nationalists because it did at least give the idea that there was going to be somewhat of a Jewish home in Palestine. After this, there was some Jewish immigration to Palestine, but actually more preferred to move to the United States as opposed to Palestine. So there wasn't these huge numbers of immigration that the Arabs were concerned about. Finally, in this recording, let's look at what happened with the three main mandated territories that were given to the British by the League of Nations between 1922 and 1939, which was the outbreak of World War II. For Transjordan, which again you can see where that is on page 96, it's directly to the east of Palestine. This particular area was not quite ready to become fully independent, even by 1928, which at that point the British government had these mandates for close to 10 years. The main reason why Transjordan did not become independent quickly was because there was an oil pipeline that went from Iraq all the way through to Palestine, and the British simply were not ready to give that up. So here you can see the beginnings of the idea that controlling the oil supply would be very important to whichever country could claim that because of the economic ramifications. 1946 is when Transjordan finally did become independent. So you can see that was quite a bit of time. This was after the Second World War that they finally got their independence under King Abdullah, who was later assassinated because there was this idea that he was going to try to make peace with the Jews in Palestine after Israel was created. Iraq was one of the other territories that the British were mandating, and in 1932 they became independent and became a member of the League of Nations. Palestine obviously was the area that was going to be the trickiest for the British giving their independence to, because that, again, was the main goal of these A-level mandates, was to give them independence in a timely fashion. In 1929, there was a series of revolts at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. Again, Jerusalem's now the capital of Israel, and it's a very holy city for three different religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And the Western Wall was a piece of the second temple that was still left. It was the only portion that was not destroyed by the Romans in AD 70 when they sacked the city and kicked all of the Jews out, which was the beginning of the diaspora. But this particular piece of the temple that remained, this wall, is considered a very holy site to Jews. And in 1929, there were some revolts that broke out because the British took down a screen that was supposed to divide men from women among Jewish worshippers. It had been recommended for it to be removed by the Arabs. So probably the Arabs were trying to instigate the Jews a bit, but there were some revolts that broke out. The British sent a commission to investigate it, and so there was some discussion over whether or not to limit Jewish immigration, because that was seen to be the root of the problem, is that the Arabs were concerned about more Jews moving into Palestine, and they wanted to bring attention to that matter. Meanwhile, in Europe, Hitler was taking over Germany, became the Fuhrer in 1933, and after doing that was able to pass the Enabling Act, which if you look at the sidebar at the top of 98, that allowed him to pass laws without needing any type of parliamentary approval, so it's basically him being a dictator. And this, we know from Mein Kampf that he targeted Jews. He considered them an enemy to the state, undesirable, whatever you want to call it. So this Enabling Act allowed him to pass other anti-Semitic laws throughout the country of Germany. Obviously, the Jews in Germany became very concerned when Hitler began doing these things, and so you would understand why many of them would want to leave Germany, which many of them did. Problem was, in the United States, there were some more restrictions put on Jewish immigration in these years before World War II, and there was more anti-Semitism breaking out in other countries of Eastern Europe, such as Poland and Romania, Hungary, and so there really wasn't a whole lot of options for where Jews could move to escape the anti-Semitism in Europe, especially if the United States was putting restrictions on them coming in. And we saw on the previous slide that that's where many of them were wanting to go. So this meant that Palestine was really the only option available for many Jews, which was the Arabs' worst nightmare, because as more and more Jewish immigration came into the region in Palestine, the Arabs felt like they would have their land taken from them. So there was a revolt that broke out in 1937 when the British suggested that Palestine could be partitioned into an Arab state and a Jewish state. The Arabs weren't willing to concede to this at all, so they revolted. And this was the same time as the Munich crisis was happening with Czechoslovakia, when Chamberlain and other European statesmen gave in to Hitler to take the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, and then Hitler ended up taking the entire country. So that was kind of occupying the minds of many European leaders. They didn't really have a whole lot of time to focus on revolts breaking out down in Palestine. Plus, with Hitler growing in power and these European leaders realizing that probably a war was going to come at some point, they did not want to risk the Arabs becoming allied to Hitler. So, in order to appease the Arabs, the British had to make it seem like they would not favor Jewish ideas of a homeland in Palestine at this time. So basically, the British kind of cut the Jews loose and instead wanted to keep the Arabs on their side against Hitler and Germany. So that meant that the Jews would have to then focus their Zionist emphasis, their idea of having a homeland, on a country besides Great Britain, because clearly the British were not going to give them much of anything at this point. So this meant that the focus was now going to become the United States, which many Jews had already moved there by this point. And you'll see after World War II, the United States is a key leader in helping the Jews get this homeland once and for all, which would become known as Israel. So basically the years after World War I is what set the stage for Israel to become a state after World War II.